This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer.
Listen to AM 560 The Answer online at 560theanswer.com, on the AM 560 mobile app, on your Alexa-powered smart speaker, and on TuneIn, iHeart, and on Odyssey. This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560 The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Elizabeth Grace Matthew writes at The Hill, thehill.com. I've been a college-level writing instructor at several universities, ranging from an elite Ivy League institution to middling state schools, for more than a decade. Most of my students have been bright, hardworking, and ambitious, but most of them could not reliably construct grammatical sentences. Writing instructor at Ivy League institutions, she said. Educational experts who purport to know what is best for children have long presided over increasing illiteracy and innumeracy and a widening achievement gap. It is interesting. It's very much like the fiscal conservative who can't stop spending, the educational expert who can't improve the quality of the educational outputs. It is worth noting. The inability to write at what was once considered a fifth grade level is now the norm among students of all socioeconomic backgrounds, races, and ethnicities, she writes. It's also the predictable result of the overemphasis on self-expression at the expense of excellence that has been driving the decline of American K-12 and higher education for decades. And her point is this: if we don't get back to the idea of mastery of subjects. She writes, first, that a mastery of subject or skill is recognizable and worthy of praise. Second, the discipline of mastery is not the opposite of creativity, but a prerequisite for it. If we don't get back to that core philosophy about education, then school choice won't matter much. All this fight for school choice to give kids education, relegated to government school systems that have failed them and previous generations for quite some time, it won't matter much if the choice is between between two institutions that are equally or substantially equally failing their students. In other words, they have the same philosophy, because so many of these pernicious philosophies in government school systems have migrated to private schools, haven't they? We've talked about that a lot over COVID, and I'm not just talking about COVID policies, but critical race theory indoctrination, the sexualization of children, the lessening of standards that she's speaking about. What does it matter, getting the kid out of the local neighborhood school in Chicago to a private Catholic school if the private Catholic school is going to be on the same program? For more on this and other topics, couldn't think of a better gentleman to discuss this with than Ian Rowe, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, senior visiting fellow at the Woodson Center, and author of Agency, the 4-Point Plan for all children to overcome the victimhood narrative and discover their pathway to power. Ian Rowe, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Dan, it's so great to be back with you, and those numbers are just sobering, and everything she's saying is absolutely correct.
And you and the Woodson Center are working sort of in advance of what she's describing needs to be done. I mean, you've developed your own curriculum in part in response to the 1619 project, but tell us, the 4-point plan that we've talked about with you before, but also sort of the effort to get a new curriculum and, by extension, a new philosophy implemented in some of the schools that do provide choice. Sure.
Well, yeah, and also just to step back, just to give even more, color to the things that she's talking about. It's not just writing; it's reading. The National Assessment for Educational Progress, which is also known as the nation's report card, just released data in 2022 that says only 32% of all American kids of all races are reading at proficiency levels at 4th grade. At 8th grade, it's 29%. Why would we expect kids coming out of a K-12 system to be effective writers and readers and mathematicians in college? And then why would we expect them to flourish once they get to the workplace or other functions of young adulthood. And so, yes, what she's saying is that we have a real crisis, that we need to a back to basics focus, and those numbers are across race. I mean, yes, there are disparities. In the Black community, this is nationwide. It's only 17% proficiency amongst Black kids in reading at fourth grade, and amongst whites, it's better. It's 42%, but still, that's more than 50%. In fact, in the entire history of the nation's report card, there's never been a year in which a majority of white students are reading at grade level. So this back to basics approach in education is crucial. And so my work with the Woodson Center and for your listeners, I also run schools in the heart of the South Bronx here in New York. So this isn't just theory for me. I see what happens not only when there's a lack of school choice. In the district in which we just opened up a school, only 7% of all kids who start ninth grade 4 years later end up graduating from high school ready for college. That means 93% of kids start ninth grade and either drop out or they do earn their high school diploma but still can't do math nor reading without remediation if they were to go to high school. So this focus, particularly in the early grades, to have what we call knowledge-based curricula that focuses on mastery. A lot of if you look at most elementary school curricula over the years, it used to be that you had social studies like history 5 days a week, science 5 days a week. Now, if you look in a lot of elementary schools, particularly in urban areas, you might have social studies or history once a week for 45 minutes, maybe twice a week, science once a week. So that rich content, the content of mastery, is replaced by a lot of sort of empty, what we call content-free curricula, which is about the main idea. It's kind of vapid content. So as kids are sort of crossing grade to grade, they're not building a mastery of knowledge and vocabulary. And that's what I think, thankfully, there's a realization, the science of reading. And again, this is not just for Black kids. This is across all races. We have a reading crisis in our country, and all this drama around critical race theory and all this other stuff is a huge distraction. And it's important to say that COVID had a huge, and all the lockdowns associated with it, had a huge adverse impact on reading outcomes. But believe me, this was an issue well before COVID.
Well, why do teachers pass the kids along knowing that they are not proficient at their grade level in math and reading?
Well, the concept of social promotion, it should be a crime. In places like Decatur, Illinois, they just released some data. Something like 2% of the Black kids were reading at grade level, and yet the approval rates for teachers was something like 98%. I mean,
that's fun with numbers.
Criminal.
I know.
It's just criminal. And so it's easier for the adults just to pass kids from grade to the next grade and not take the responsibility for knowing that this kid is not prepared. We do our students no favors by lowering standards, by pushing kids along. When people talk about systemic racism and systemic discrimination, let's really talk about systemic racism and systemic discrimination when kids of all races are being passed along when we know they cannot do the material.
No, but Ian, we're not dumbing down. You see, we're reimagining. We're breaking old shibboleths. For example, this is an English teacher, high school English teacher from a high school in California, and this was something she chose to offer up online on TikTok to explain the linguistics lessons she's embarking upon with her high school students.
As an educator, I am constantly worried if I am part of the problem. What do I mean by that? Well, public education is an institution that upholds lots of problematic systems in our society, like white supremacy and misogyny and colonization, etc. In my role as an educator, I try to undermine that BS in my classroom as much as I possibly can. I teach high school English, and whew, the white supremacy runs deep. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at how we write essays. Start with an introduction that includes a thesis. Always cite your sources. Use transition words like however and therefore. These are all made up rules. They're arbitrary. They were created by Westerners in power. In linguistic justice, April Baker Bell calls this the language of respectability or the language of power. Which got me thinking, what if I started my school year with a unit honoring how we talk rather than teaching students how to write properly? So this is the start of my series on teaching linguistics in high school.
What do you think, Ian? We got to attack bibliographies before we get the kids to learn what needs to be learned.
She'd be fired from my schools.
Well, I know that, but what do you think in terms of how representative that is of the philosophy?
I mean, come on. The whole idea that the whole idea that somehow having to state a thesis
racist
is somehow white supremacy. Honestly, it's racist unto itself. This teacher doesn't realize, or maybe she does, who knows, but what she's actually saying is so racist that she's ascribing objective standards like having a thesis, having evidence, having logic, being able to read well, somehow is a function of white supremacy. She recognized that the direct implication of that is she's saying, well, so therefore, what is black? What does it mean to be black? Does that mean absence of evidence? Absence of objective standards, absence of having a logical thesis? She doesn't even realize what she is saying. It needs to be rejected. It needs to be repudiated. And I know that there's a general fear of responding to this kind of nonsense, but it's nonsense. And we all have to have the courage to step back and reject this ideology and focus on things like what I try to do, which is run schools that build agency, that focus on high standards, high expectations, knowledge-based curriculum that doesn't just pass kids from one grade to another. We know how to do this. We're having a conference in Chicago tomorrow at 11:30 at the Chicago Club talking exactly about these issues and how we can improve educational outcomes for all kids, where we reject this kind of ideology.
So let me ask you this from your perspective, particularly since you're in the space, as you said, running schools in the Bronx and tough areas. You're on the policy front. You're on every front possible in education, basically. And these dreary statistics we were just reciting back and forth. Why hasn't there been a parental revolt against the way things are done in these schools? Because generally speaking, there hasn't been.
Generally speaking, there hasn't been. I mean, there hasn't been a revolt. There's been a bolt in the sense of more and more parents are just leaving the system. I think Chicago schools have lost 120,000 kids in the last couple of years. New York City schools have lost close to 200,000 kids. So parents are starting to vote with their feet. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the systems that are left over still are facing huge amounts of dysfunction. And what we've seen certainly with COVID and remote instruction, more parents had more direct visibility into what their kids were learning or not. And that's where, I think more and more parents were seeing the implementation of critical race theory in classrooms, gender ideology now, imposing its way into classrooms. I think the one bright spot, though, is that there has been a greater focus on school boards, more parents saying, whoa. I can be concerned with disparities in our country, but I don't want that to mean that you're now telling my kid that he is an oppressor simply because of his race, or he's oppressed simply because, you're going way too far. And so there has been an outgrowth of organizations like Parents Defending Education, Moms for Liberty, Fair for All. So I think there is one bright spot in that there are more and more parents recognizing, look, they are the first educator. If you look at the election in the governor of Virginia last year, when his opponent said, parents essentially have no right to play a role in their kids' education, I think there is a resounding message against that. And my hope is that even as we head towards these next major elections, that fervor amongst parents will remain.
He is Ian Rowe, resident fellow of the American Enterprise Institute, senior visiting fellow at the Woodson Center, author of Agency, the 4-point plan for all children to overcome the victimhood narrative and discover their pathway to power. He's also involved in the 1776 Project and the curriculum associated with that. And again, Ian, tomorrow you and others having a conference on these topics that we've been discussing at the Chicago Club at 11:30?
Yes. It's all about